privilege. So I want to do a couple of things today. Each week I start this conversation, or it's not really a conversation yet, is it? During the week, it's a conversation with you. Each week I begin this by trying to lay a little bit of groundwork because I know here in BC and in Canada in general, we don't think we need to talk about privilege, white, male, whatever privilege. We don't think we need to talk about it. We think we love diversity, we love people, we set the standard for welcoming new immigrants and refugees. We carry that. We carry that and our example to the world. So why are we talking about this? The reality is we're talking about it because it's still a thing, because there is still underlying currents of problems in our society. And someone asked me this week, well, what does this have to do with faith? It was actually at that interfaith meeting, and they're like, okay, so if we want to talk about this in a faith context, what does this have to do with faith? Do I have a ring? Am I ringing? Yes. Dean, can you hear that? Can you help? I don't know anything. But it's gonna, who knows where I'll go if I keep hearing that. We have a sense that we don't need to talk about this, right? And that's fair, and I get it. And the second conversation that we have, okay, how does this relate to faith? And then how does this relate to my own story? Because I feel like I've had to work super hard to get every step of where I've gotten to. I've had to claw back from this, and I've had these setbacks. Life is hard, period. And so the question is, what does privilege look like in a Canadian context where we are diverse, where we are working hard at creating diverse communities? And what does that look like in a Christian context where we want to say, well, we don't need to see race. Why are we talking about race? Why are we talking about these, in another sense, why are we talking about these earthly things when we should talk about the inner beauty or something else? I don't know. Put whatever argument you want there. The reality is it's still a thing. The reality is that here in Canada, and let's while we're at it, we've mostly been talking about white privilege, but we're talking about privilege as a whole, and we're talking about those underlying currents of social injustices in our society, and sometimes we're aware of them. If you live with privilege, you are probably not aware of them unless you are actively seeking to understand it better. And that's what this conversation is about. And that's why it matters to do it in church, to have this conversation in church. So let's do one more caveat before we keep going. What we don't want. We don't want to come out of this going, so privileged, I'm such a bad person, what am I going to do now? Because I can't change it, I'm white, and I'm a man, and I'm cis, and I'm straight, and I can't fix any of that. And that's not the purpose of the conversation. The purpose of the conversation is to be aware of it, and then to be asking the questions, well, what can I do from my place of privilege to be talking, to be aware of, to change the status quo? All right, so glazed over. This is heavy. Sorry. I don't have a light story for you either. It's a hard conversation. It's hard to talk about. It's hard to not feel defensive from different places. It's just difficult. So let's talk about some facts, and maybe that'll help keep us going here. The reality is, here in Canada, we have a gender wage gap. In BC, I think if I'm remembering all the number right, that's about 13. It's about 13 cents to the dollar. Sorry, let me restate that. It's about 87 cents to the dollar that women make in across the country, and that varies up and down. For the most part, BC flatlines right in the middle on all of these stats going forward, which kind of surprised me because, again, we're the Northwest, we're BC, but so we go, okay, well, and we start trying to explain away the things. Education, well, that's a problem, right? Women might take more time off work, or women are, and those are all true statements, but that doesn't make it okay in our society. So there's a conversation to be had there. Next things next. Let's keep going because this is fun. University-educated immigrants in BC versus Canadian-born university-educated citizens in BC make 20 cents less on the dollar. Again, we start working through our heads. Well, why is that? It's hard to translate university degrees from other countries. Sometimes there's still language barriers that we have to get toward. But we can work through and start knocking these things off the list with more controlled studies, and it still comes out negative. It still comes out to be a problem. Worse than that is that let's take the immigration status out of the picture and talk simply about visible minorities, university educated, Canadian born, so English speaking from birth. We've removed all of the numbers and all of those things. Still, depending on where you are in Canada, 12 to 18% different in wage. Here in BC, that's about 13 cents a dollar. In incorporated businesses across the country, 4 times more men in leadership roles or in senior management positions than women. It goes on and on. One interesting thing, okay? So this I found very interesting. Here in BC, we are right in the middle on visible minority wage gap, 13 cents, and then it goes way up if you're on the East Coast, and then down if you're on the far, like Newfie and that area. But we're right in the middle, around 13 cents. Perceived prejudice in the workforce is down around 5%. So you go, I don't feel like I'm being prejudiced against, but the numbers are there. We think we're doing a good job, but the numbers are there. So we have to be asking these questions. And what is our role? Some of you are employers. Some of you make hiring decisions. Some of you make housing decisions. Some of you make decisions in your community that can be impacted by this or can be influenced by this. So here's a starting place. Now we're aware. Now we know. Now we can begin working against it. So there's one more number, and it's hard to get a grasp on what this number is. But the distinction between income, if you are First Nations or not, or British descent, is unbelievably huge. In some parts of the country, it's over 50% difference in income levels. Even if we talk about university educated and we start taking some of those factors away, it's still well over 20%. Huge numbers that you face if you are First Nations. So we're still in this phase. I know we're 3 weeks in, but we're still in this phase of really understanding what does it mean to be privileged? What does it mean to talk about this? And nobody looks at those numbers and says, okay, well, this is due to these racist people in this organization or this business. It's not that kind of conversation. It's a conversation about subtle influences that are occurring in our society that we have to talk about in order to address. And that's why it's important to talk about it here in Canada, even though in the States, this is a much different conversation. I told a few of my stories the first week. I have lots. I grew up in Texas. I lived in Atlanta, Georgia for a while. I lived in New Orleans. I have lots of stories about overt and discreet and casual racism that we could talk about all day. But then you tell me, well, that's a U.S. problem. But this is not a U.S. problem. This is also a Canadian problem. And until we can talk about that, we can't begin improving and getting past it. I'll tell you that as I came across article after article, it's about 50% of those that say we don't need to have this conversation in Canada. And so you're not alone if you're feeling that right now and you're experiencing that right now. But let's talk about the text. So, okay, the numbers are there. We have significant problems that we don't want to identify, that we don't want to talk about. Let's talk about why this matters. Okay, so what does this have to do with the Bible? What does this have to do with our faith? What is my role here, or why are we talking about this in church? Shouldn't Maple Ridge be like putting on some sort of seminar or something like that? Why are we doing this in church? Well, good question. And part of that answer is because we should be having conversations about problems in our society here. Like part of our role, if we're going to carry God's love into our community, is to know what our community is facing. Other thing is, we're not that far removed, even Open Door, but the church as a whole is not that far removed from having serious problems with how we treat women. Certainly, we're still talking on a broad scale in church how we treat people that identify as LGBT. We have massive social issues that we're not addressing in churches. So we're not removed from the broader culture. Let's just skip that conversation. But if we're to be carrying God's love into our community and showing God's love into every individual that we commune with here and that walks in our doors and that we have dinner with on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, if we are having all of those things and our goal, our purpose, our drive is to carry God's love into the world, we have to know what's going on. It's not surprising that I might talk about oppression in the Bible or social issues from the text, but a driving force throughout the text is pain, suffering, oppression, marginalization. And it goes all the way through, from the very, very early on, all the way through. There's a little subtle statement that Amos makes that I adore. Because we tell the story of God, and we talk about Israel and what God is doing in the world, and we start with Abraham, and then we tell the story of Moses and God bringing this very special people out of the land of Egypt, and God's story is told through Israel. And then every once in a while we get a glimpse of, oh wait, God's the God of all creation, not just Israel and not just the Christians after that story. God is God. And Amos, with the voice of God, is speaking to the people. And he says, are you not like, it's very subtle, are you not like the Ethiopians to me, O people of Israel, says the Lord? Did I not bring Israel up from the land of Egypt, and Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Ker? Wait a second. Let's try that again. Are you not like the Ethiopians to me, O people of Israel? Well, first of all, no, we're not like the Ethiopians, God, says the Lord. Did I not bring Israel up from the land of Egypt? This is an amazing feat of miraculous God power, strength into the world, pulling people out of suffering. And the Philistines from Caphtor, wait a second. No, the Philistines are our enemy. They are the bad guys. We don't talk about them. Certainly God's not doing anything for them. And the Philistines from Caphtor and the Arameans from Ker. All of the sudden, God speaks into this community. Look, I've done a lot with you, for you, through you, but have I also not brought up the Philistines? And are you also not like the Ethiopians to me? Meaning, do I not also love the Ethiopians? And you tell your story like it's the only, but did I not also bring the Arameans from Ker? And you go, this story was about me. Oh, now it's about other people too. Here is this moment where God speaks into this community and says, it's not just you. Now, we're not talking in this conversation only about other countries. We're talking about the subtleties of race and privilege and gender. And here, God says, remember others also. Back in the laws, God says we should do a whole series on sojourners. It's such a beautiful context. But God has specific laws set up to remind you, look, you've been a foreigner, you've been a wanderer, you've been in weird lands and relied on people to care for you. Now you have the opportunity and are mandated to do the same. Part of your purpose as a nation that's going to bless other nations is to care for the sojourner. Is to leave the corners of your fields ungleaned so that others can come and be supported in your community. It is the story of God all the way through to care for people on the margins. Now, when we talk about privilege, we're talking about a slightly different lens and slightly different perspective than simply caring for people on the margins. But if we're going to understand privilege, we have to begin seeing the world through the eyes of others that we encounter. And this is what God says in that moment. Are you not also like the Ethiopians? Look for 1 second through the eyes of another person, another community, another individual, and see the world and what I'm doing there. It's subtle. but it's real. By the time we move into the New Testament, Paul is carrying this forward in the treatment of women and their roles in the church, in whether you are Greek or slave or free or whoever you are to be one community. Whoever you are loved by God and to be cared for as one of God's children. And I want to close thinking about a text from Hebrews, a few lines from Hebrews. I came across this reading about the story of a man who lived in the States during slavery, and he's white, and he began pushing forward an agenda to set slaves free. And he did everything he could. In fact, let me see if I can find this real quick. In fact, Frederick Douglass, Frederick Douglass writes of this gentleman, John Brown. He writes, "His zeal in the cause of my race was far greater than mine. It was as the burning sun to my taper light. Mine was bounded by time. His stretched away to the boundless shores of eternity. I could live for the slave, but he could die for him." And so in Brown's final speech, and what's interesting is the way textbooks and things often portray Brown. We're moving into U.S. story for a moment, as the way textbooks often refer to Brown as this crazy, unstable guy. But in his final speech, he's in court on trial for, I think it's a number of things, treason, inciting violence, and all these other things. He says, I came across this Hebrews passage. He says, "I never intended murder or treason or the destruction of property or to excite or incite slaves to rebellion or to make insurrection. I did, however, intended certainly to have made a clean thing to set free slaves." And then he writes, sorry, I've lost it. It's coming. It's okay. "This court acknowledges, as I suppose," this doesn't sound like an unstable person to me, by the way. This court acknowledges, as I suppose, the validity of the law of God. I see a book kissed here, which I suppose to be the Bible, or at least the New Testament, that teaches me that all things whatsoever I would that man should do to me, I should do even so to them. It teaches me further to remember, and this is a quote from Hebrews, to remember them that are in bonds as to be bound with them. I have interfered as I have done, as I have always freely admitted, in behalf of God's despised poor, was not wrong, but was right. And so he's quoting this line in Hebrews chapter 13. "Let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers." There's our sojourners conversation again. "For by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. Remember those who are in prison as though you were in prison with them. Those who were being tortured as though you yourselves were being tortured." So think about your life, think about your faith, think about your purpose in terms of those that have been marginalized on the side. And so we ask ourselves, what does it mean to be privileged or marginalized? How do we understand what this is and what's going on? And then what can we do about it? What is our role? Beyond talking, beyond the conversation, what is our purpose in this conversation? Hebrews asks you to understand where someone else is coming from. God in Amos asks you to understand where someone else is coming from. To look through the eyes of another individual and take a step in their shoes. How can we understand our own privilege at the many different levels, at the many different complexities? How can we understand what that looks like for someone else that is less privileged or differently privileged? How do we respond? Where is it that God speaks through that story and allows us to be a light in our community?